Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
from sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. Welcome everyone to this week's episode of Recover You. This is Kylene. Patrick is actually doing a solo episode this week. He surprised me by sending me a text when I was out of town saying, hey, I recorded a podcast. So that was very thoughtful of him. I had a chance to listen to it, and I just wanted to put a couple little notes really quickly. In case a betrayed partner is listening, there are two phrases he used that may be slightly triggering. And I want to clarify the intention behind them so that when you hear them, you're not hearing them from the interpretation that might be upsetting. So let me just kind of walk through that really quickly. So one of them was he was mentioning the whole topic today is why betrayed partners are so upset and so angry by the betrayal. And one of the things that he mentioned was when we find out that the addict has been looking at all this pornography and all these sexualized images, the betrayed partner feels like they can't compare, or I think he worded it in a way where we're upset because we know we can't compare to that. Now, what he means isn't that you're not valuable or you're less attractive or anything like that. It means we feel like we can't compare to the fakeness, the entertainment, the high, right? So the reality is we can't because it's unhealthy. The reality is we can't compare to something that is completely fake. The environment is fake. The stimulus is fake. The lack of, whether you're talking about pornography or whether you're talking about cyber sex or whether you're talking about an affair, the reality is the environment within that where there are no consequences. It's like playing a video game. We can't compare to that because real life has ups and downs, but the addict environment only has the ups. So I just want to clarify that because I didn't want you to hear that and hear him say something like wives cannot compare to pornography. That's absolutely not what he meant at all. The other one was, and he changed the wording later on in the episode, but he was talking to the addict saying that the finding out of the betrayal makes the betrayed partner crazy. Again, it's just the wording there, and he rewords it later on. He means it makes us feel crazy. You're not crazy. And that's actually kind of his point through the whole episode is the betrayed partner is not crazy. There are valid reasons for why they feel this way. And he's going to walk through all of the reasons that we feel upset. And he's going to walk through the reasons that the addict needs to take responsibility for the anger that we feel, for the upset and the sadness. So I just want to clarify those two things because I know as a betrayed partner, sometimes when we're listening to things, it can hit our ears in a different way. And I know exactly what he's thinking and what he means by it. So I just wanted to offer that. And I'm just so thankful that he was so thoughtful to do this for me this week. So we hope that you enjoy it. And thanks for listening.
Hello, everyone. This is Pat hopping on here, and I wanted to come on here and give you some thoughts on something. And, part of it is Kylene is out of town. She went down to Florida to visit a friend, and she's on her way back tonight, but don't know whether she'll make it on time and could lead to it looks like a late arrival tonight. She could be super tired tomorrow. So I decided I'd come on here and talk through some thoughts I've had recently about essentially why our spouses are so mad at us, right? And what goes into the root of that as best I can. And, once again, this is me just kind of carrying on with some thoughts and things that I hear from the guys and what I experienced in my own marriage with Kylene. And actually, I was thinking through a little bit of how I felt when my first wife cheated, and how those things showed up. So I think when you heal it, especially as the addict. Actually, I guess for all of us, right? When we heal, we grow in emotional intelligence, and so we. If you just think about the breakdown of that word, we become smarter with our emotions. And so as we become smarter with our emotions, we become smarter at connecting with other people and their emotions, and hopefully meeting them or empathizing with them or providing some help and support as people move through their emotions. One of the things that I think, especially for the addict, when they start to go through this process, is they start to understand ever so slowly that their emotions are there to tell them something. And before, any sort of uncomfortable emotion, we want to cover up and we want to mask it, and we don't want it to be there. And we almost view it as a bad thing. And so, what's important through this process is to understand where these emotions are coming from, and to welcome them in, and be curious and say, hey, why am I resentful today? Why am I feeling angry? Why am I, why did somebody cutting me off on the highway make me so mad? And it's usually an indicator of something. And so, there's a lot of stories of little things that'll set you off, and maybe at work, and you come home and you maybe unload on your family, and then you feel bad about that, and feeling those are all a whole bunch of cocktail of emotions all wrapped up in there. So anyway, but I wanted to go through what I believe is a lot of the reasons why when you get discovered, or you continue to act in the behavior that you swore to your spouse that you would stop, and why they get so angry, why they get so hurt, why they do things like, please don't touch me. And so I'm just going to kind of riff on that over the next so many minutes, and just food for thought for you. And so I think the first thing, which is probably obvious, is that you were engaging in behavior with someone else in a sexual way. And for a lot of people, that could be whether you're engaging with the screen in pornography or cybersex, or if you had a physical affair, or whatever that may be, is you have crossed the line that your spouse had in their minds. They felt that whether it was your vows or what you told them, or what their understanding of what the marriage would be, coming in, is that you would only do that with them. And so when the spouse finds out that you were not only doing it with them, it can be very, very hurtful. It can be, they move into situations where they question their own physical appearance, and because they know they can't compare. In a lot of cases, it's you just can't you can't compare with that, and so it's it's very hurtful. It makes them crazy when they find that out. Like in my case, and Kylene would say this to me. She's like, "Gosh, how many women do you think you saw?" And that's a hard question to hear, but it's a window to the anguish that she's feeling. It's a window to she's like, I was not. In a wounded standpoint, she can end up saying, well, I was not good enough to hold his attention. Now, that's not true, right? She absolutely is good enough. I was just extremely wounded, and I engaged in bad behavior. And so, that's that. I think that would be the first thing is, the spouses are feeling as if you crossed over a line. And so that one, I think, that's a big one. But I think what starts to almost take on a bigger role is when you don't take responsibility for it. So it's one thing for you to have been an addict or to have had an affair, right? And then at the moment where they're expressing the anger, and you in turn minimize it, or you say, yeah, but I loved you, or even when you determine that you're an addict, you use that as an excuse. You kind of say, yeah, but I was an addict. I wasn't in control. I couldn't be helped. Like you still need to be, accountable. You still need to be accountable for the behavior that you engaged in, for the way you hurt somebody. And so when we don't do that, or when we don't tell the whole story, or when we don't engage in healing activity, and empathy and the taking of responsibility, it also makes them crazy. They in the Conquer series, it talks about, Ted Roberts says that a staggered disclosure creates the profile of a rape victim in a spouse. And I think it's the constant traumas that come on. So keep that in mind. How are people going to act when they're traumatized? If we want sympathy for the hurt that was in our life that led us to be an addict, or led us to acting out sexually, physically, or whatever that may be, we can't then minimize their reactions and their hurt that we have perpetrated on them. So I think when they feel like we are not fully taking into account their the pain that they have heard just from the notion of discovery, it's almost like a double trauma at that point. They feel like they're going crazy. I remember Kylene used to say that, I feel like I'm crazy. And it took me about 3-ish weeks, I think, to start really telling the truth. And part of that is I almost didn't know the truth. Or actually, I take that back. That's actually not a good thing to say. Of course, I knew the truth. My point is, I probably was in a little bit of denial about the extent. Maybe that's a better way to say it. So as she did her forensics and looked at things, I remember being like, oh no, and then later on she'd show the evidence. And so I just remember at that point, she would come down and she would say, hey, I noticed this app that you downloaded. And to be honest, I wouldn't remember a lot of that because it was just so frantic, but I wouldn't deny it. I would say, yeah, yep, I did. Because at that point, what are you going to do? You're going to dispute with Apple? You know what I mean? Like it's just, at that point, you got to take responsibility. And I noticed that when I would just not even, gaslight or try, she would be mad, and she had a right to be mad about this whole situation. But the fact that there was no confrontation, I think, made her feel a little bit better, that I was willing just to say, yeah, I did that. And so it's as you move through the notion of discovery, just keep in mind that if you stagger your disclosure to your spouses, you're going to provide, or you're going to hurt them even deeper. I mean, the hurt of discovery and the hurt of maybe you had told them that you won't ever look at something again, but you started, and all of these different things. But, I would highly encourage you, tell the whole truth. If you guys are moving towards a therapeutic disclosure and you all have agreed that you won't until that happens, then certainly do that. But I would just encourage you, as the addict and the acting out partner, if they come to you and they ask you a question, answer that question. And, at one point, Kylene said to me that she felt like I had snapped the connection between the two of us. And that was probably about, I don't know, June, 6 months in, something like that, 5-6 months in. And I was like, oh, there's no way. There's just no way that it'll ever get created again. But I just engaged in healing. I did the work. Kylene did a lot of deep work. And, here it is 5+ years later. And she texts me, I think it was Saturday or Friday night. And she was like, hey, I really, really love you. And so I'm like, oh, wow, that's something that I never thought would get recreated. But I think it was helped by the fact that I was willing to be open and honest and allow her to live in the rage. You know what I mean? Like, at times she had to be angry, and I had to see it. So, I think they're angry because you have engaged sexually with other people. They're angry because you have manipulated them. You're the person that's supposed to be their ride or die, and ride or dies don't manipulate your friends. I mean, think about those times when that's happened to you. When maybe a really, really good friend or a boss or a coworker or somebody manipulated the truth with you. How did you feel? And so, you've got to think about this. I think sometimes, guys especially, be like, yeah, but everybody looks at porn. I'm like, yeah, but she's not mad at everybody. She's mad at you because you either told her you would quit or you made, like I did, told her it wasn't a problem anymore, and then went about my, life, hiding it, covering it up. And certainly I was in anguish, and she understood that. But at the end of the day, I did those. It's the whole notion of both and, right? It's like, yes, I had an addiction. Yes, it was driven by a lot of pain and trauma in my life, and yes, I wanted to stop, and yes, I all of those things, and I manipulated the truth with her. I gaslit her. I didn't, provide her the full picture of who I was when we went to the wedding, right? And so she married me under, you could argue, false pretenses. And so all of those things conspire, and they come together to really make our spouses pissed off at us, right? And so you got to understand that. You got to understand that they're going to feel these things. I think one of the other points that I didn't really get this for a long time, but I see it more and more, and I think it is the and I'm speaking about this from like the man betrayed and the women were or the man was the addict and the woman was betrayed. But I can imagine it would go the same the other way. It's their belief of who we can be. We're not living into it. And so, when and if you think about that, and maybe this will take you a little while to get there, but our spouses really hold us up in high regard. And I'll tell you this, a regard that we can live into, but we got to work on it. We got to heal it. So when we don't live into it, well, it makes them mad. It's like, they're like, hey, why can't, I need you to be more. I need you to be a man who's less reactive, not a man that doesn't feel emotion, because those are two separate things, but maybe a man who's less reactive. Can you absorb the criticism from me over your behavior without getting defensive, without gaslighting, without turning it around, without punishing, or whatever that may be, and turning it back around? Can you stand in the fire and take responsibility? And because that's what good men do, and that's what leaders do. They always talk about this whole be a leader in the family with the church and all these different things. And I have said this, a couple times. It's like, I feel the leadership that the scriptures are talking about is not telling your family what to do. It's about leading with empathy. It's about learning how to be more healed, learning how to be emotionally safe. And by providing that safety for your family, you end up creating an environment that is really, really healthy. And so anytime you gaslight, and anytime you yell, and anytime you pout, and anytime you shut down communication because somebody's asking you about your previous behavior, are you leading or are you pouting? And so I think what our spouses inherently know is they know what we can be. And sometimes we're just too stubborn, unhealed, stupid, whatever that is, to recognize that that's where they're going. And we can actually live there. So imagine if you could live into the version of what our spouses, wanted us to be. And imagine the healing that comes around. So, keep that in mind as, when your spouse is upset. Sometimes you get surprised by the emotion. And this certainly happened in our relationship. We would go days and weeks. As we moved deeper and deeper into recovery, with everything was fine, and then all of a sudden, Kylene would get triggered, or she would get sad. And I used to always say this, like, in some ways it got a little harder for me to be present. It's one thing when you're always in trouble, like day to day to day to minute to minute to minute. And you can, you kind of get used to that, right? It's almost like being in boot camp, in the military. But when you are on a high because you guys are maybe doing really, really well, and then you come home from work and your wife is triggered, and maybe she doesn't want to talk to you, and maybe she doesn't want you to touch her, and it's surprising. And so you just got to remember that she's trying to listen to her body. She's trying to listen to what her mind is telling her, what her her emotions are telling her. And, people need that space. And so, the best thing you can do in that situation is do your very best to be present and to practice empathy. You don't have to emotionally react to their emotions. You can be calm. You can be kind. You can be all of those things. And when you do that and you practice that on an ongoing basis, it turns into a blessing, and it allows your wife to start to see you now for the person that she always believed you were, right? And so, that's the level of anger that comes from it. And I remember being that, like, it was a little confusing to me, especially on the like, hey, don't touch me. It was odd, but I think once I started to learn about what safety entailed, it's like I knew I wasn't going to do anything physically bad to Kylene, but I had deeply, deeply wounded her physiologically, psychologically, and emotionally, and I guess spiritually. I had done all of those things, and she just didn't feel, her whole body was out of sorts. She didn't feel emotionally safe around me. She didn't know what I was looking at day to day. She didn't know what my motivations were. So, if you're around somebody who you've had kids with and all these different things, and all of a sudden you find that person, doesn't tell you the truth or doesn't do anything like that, man, that's challenging. And so, I think it's, just keep that in mind as you're walking through this period, and understand that they are mad for many, many reasons, but you betrayed them. You were dishonest. You manipulated. You're not living into the version that they want, and whether, sometimes people are like, well, I always looked at you as a Prince Charming and now you're not. You're like, well, that's actually a really good vision to live into. And so, I think being able to, Prince Charming, sometimes people go, well, that's the patriarchy and all this stuff, but I'm not going to get into that. When I view the comment of Prince Charming, it's somebody who cares for their wife, who is kind, who is always honest, who is a protector. It's all of those things. And that's the vision they have. And that's the vision Kylene had for me. And I blew it. I wasn't able to live into it. So, the next time you're surprised by your wife's anger, or if you're brand new into this and you just can't understand why your spouse is so angry with you, just remember you have kind of destroyed their world. Their impression of what they believed you could be, their impression of what their life was and is now forever changed. And you can get it back, but you got to work on it. And so, that's the thing I would encourage you is if you find yourself getting very, very reactive to your wife's anger and you lash out and get defensive and pout and all of those things that are not helpful in a relational context, keep sharing those things with your group, work that out with your therapist, grab the book, Help or Heal. Those are things that kind of help you. You don't want to be, a robot in how you go about doing it, but you also got to remember that your wife is not there, especially early on as you're moving through this betrayal, to help you manage your pain. If she chooses to, that's fantastic. But she is not the holder and the keeper for all your pain. At such point, when you provided safety again, or provided a more consistent view for her, and she chooses to, she can step in and start to help you work through things. And Kylene certainly did that for me. I mean, I would be able to tell her some of the things I was learning and how things had affected me. And she was sympathetic. And I know there were days when she was more sympathetic than others, maybe days when she was less reactive and stuff like that. But, certainly there was times when she was more capable to be able to help me through my pain than others. And so I always allowed her to lead in that. When she would say, hey, what did you learn in group today? Or what did you think? And there would be occasionally, I'd be like, well, this and this and this. And then, she might, depending on where her emotional state was in that moment, say something like, maybe say something snarky. And that's also okay. It really is okay. So, it doesn't take away from what you're learning. It's just you're in the presence of somebody that you have hurt and you're working through it. And so I think it's very good for us as recovering addicts and for discovered addicts to see the pain that we have caused. And so don't shy away from seeing that and absorbing that and trying to find ways to manage that and be less reactive. Now, you can be sad and talk to your group and check in on the Freedom Fight app and say, hey, today I had resentment, or today I was sad, or today I was, this. And I remember early on, Kylene would say, I will never do this, or I will never do that. And certainly those things aren't true anymore. But at the time, it's what she needed to say. So keep that in mind, that as you show more healing and safety, that those things will come. But I think the final thing would, the final thing I want to leave you, and I said this earlier, is they're mad because they have a vision of us that they want us to live into. And if we go through the process, we can actually be and live into that vision. And so don't run away from the pain when your spouse is really rooting for you, and maybe she's in a figurative way kicking your butt. Okay, so lean into that, allow that process to come around you, and stand up and live into the consequences. Because over time, these things are going to be really, really good for you and really good for your relationship. All right. Thank you. Hope you all have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks.
Well, we are so grateful that you listened to this episode this week. Patrick mentions the process and the work several times throughout this episode. I would encourage you to go to our website, www.recoveru, you like university, recoverucoaching.com. The link is in the show notes. Click resources at the top of the page, and you will see a whole page full of resources for the addict, for the betrayed partner, listed out there, including who to work with, books to read, podcasts. A lot of information is on that page. So make sure you check it out. And remember, every day is a new opportunity to choose health and freedom. Make that choice today, and we will see you next week. Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.